And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in New York, Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. In our nation's capital, Peter Jones, Professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And back here in studio, Saeed Ranama, Professor of Political Science at York University, and Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst and Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Good to have you two here in our studio and are welcoming to our guests in Points Beyond. I guess I want to set up tonight's discussion this way. I think it's fair to say that most of the world's attention has been focused on the Israeli concerns as they relate to Iran's potentially possessing nuclear weapons. We will get to that tonight, but we want to start and spend a bit of time as well on the notion that it is also true that much of the Sunni Muslim world is deeply opposed to Iran's nuclear program. So let us start there. Janice, to you first. How are the Middle East's major Sunni countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, reacting to Iran's nuclear program?
It's actually quite interesting, Steve, because there is an official reaction, which is reasonably muted, and there is an unofficial reaction. And the unofficial reaction, particularly coming from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, and interestingly enough, from some members of Fatah as well, expresses what I can only say is grave concern about the nuclear program. They see it as a potential game changer between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It is putting pressure on the Saudi government, as well as very strong pressure on the Egyptian government to restart nuclear activities. There is, I think, intense discomfort at the idea that there will be the leading Shia state will have a nuclear program, potentially a nuclear weapons program.
Is that the official or unofficial line?
That's the unofficial.
The unofficial.
That's right.
But the official line is?
The official line it's actually quite interesting. There's silence, but there's no disclaimer that this is of no concern to anybody else.
Okay, Rashid Khalidi, how would you answer that question?
I would answer it very differently. I think the distinction to make is between public opinion in the Arab countries and Turkey, which, according to the Pew Trust poll, which I think we should listen to and look at very carefully, does not indicate very much concern about the possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons, and between the regimes, which with obviously the exception of Turkey, are non-democratic and do not in any way represent their people, which have a different view. So I would agree with Professor Stein that officially and unofficially, Egypt, Saudi Arabia have said a variety of things, but looking at public opinion in the Sunni world, I don't think that it fits the paradigm that you said. I don't think Sunnis are afraid. I think unrepresentative autocratic regimes in the Arab world are afraid, and to some degree, I think have been stampeded into this because of their weakness, their unrepresentative nature, their lack of legitimacy, and by the fact that Iran is able to appeal over their heads to restive public opinion in their countries, restive Sunni opinion, which doesn't pay much attention to the fact that, that Iran is a Shia country. They just see Iran as standing up to the United States or standing up to Israel. So the distinction I would make is between public opinion, which is much less concerned about this, and some of these regimes, in particular unrepresentative, undemocratic regimes in the Arab world.
Let me get Saeed Ranam on the same thing.
Well, you know, I mean, before answering that, I would like to say that, of course, when we talk of fear of Islamic regime in Iran, the first question is that whose fear, of course. Usually in the West, it's mainly the fear on the part of the international community led by Americans, Israelis, Europe, and also Iranian neighboring countries. There is another fear of the Iranian people and the civil society, which are under brutal rule. But coming back, which I hope that you would also get the chance to discuss that, coming back to the international fear, no doubt there is a legitimate fear, but not to the extent that Israelis and neocons say that they make it existential threat, you know. There is no such existential threat on the part of Iran. Iran does not have these capabilities to attack Israel. But this has become part of the propaganda against this regime, which somebody like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is very clever to pick, you know, and take advantage of this, you know. All these dichotomies of Sunni, Shi'i, and then Iranians, Arabs, Arab Ajam, while these are true, but at the same time, the political elements are far more important. The political elements bring some Shiis on the part of the Sunnis, some Sunnis on the part of the Shiis, so it changes the thing. So you cannot generalize that all Arab Sunnis are worried about the situation in Iran. Even during the Iran-Iraq war, this was not the case. You know, some sided with Iran, some remained neutral, some even sent troops to fight Iran. So we should be aware of this category.
Understand the distinction. Peter Jones, how would you weigh in on that?
Well, I think that I definitely agree with the speaker who talked about the split between the ruling elites and the publics in most of the Sunni countries. Certainly to the extent that they focus on international affairs issues in most of the Sunni countries, the population is consumed by the Arab-Israeli dispute. And the Iranians have been very skillful at playing that dispute into this entire situation. I would also add that the fear, if you will, of the elites in many of the Sunni countries of Iran is not new. It goes back to the days of the Shah. It goes back to the days of the Iran-Iraq war. So the nuclear issue, of course, is the latest manifestation of that, but it's not new. And as one of the previous speakers said, you have to draw some distinctions.
I think that's quite true, that there's a long history of tension. The Iran-Iraq war itself reflected that tension. And yes, there was one, principally one state, Syria, that supported Iran, but the overwhelming number of Sunni governments certainly supported Iraq, and that's when you really saw in the modern Libya, but very neutral, very few, relatively speaking. The overwhelming majority of Sunni governments lined up, not unexpectedly, behind Iraq. So this is not a new story, but the tension is very real.
So Peter Jones, let me get you to react to what Rashid Khalidi said a moment ago, which was the people may think one way about it, but their unrepresentative, undemocratic governments think a different way about it, and it's important that we understand the distinction. Are you on side with that?
I think so, yes, but I think that the way that plays out in reality is that these governments, though they may be unrepresentative in the sense of being unelected, they do have to watch what is sometimes known as the Arab street. They can't completely disregard public opinion, and therefore, as Janice said, it's a somewhat muted reaction officially, even though unofficially they're quite worried about this sort of thing. They can't be, the elites in these countries can't be seen to be overtly anti-Iranian, because it would play into this question of the Arab-Israeli dispute and how the Iranians have played that.
Rashid Khalidi, Sunnis for years have warned us about what they call a Shia crescent in the Middle East. Could you help our viewers, first of all, understand what that is a reference to and why there would be concern about that?
Well, there are Shia populations. There are different forms of Shiism, but there are Shia populations in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, obviously, and in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, as well as several of the smaller Gulf countries, Bahrain in particular, but also the Emirates and Kuwait. And obviously, Iran is the largest single Shia country. There's also a large Shia population in different parts of South Asia, in Pakistan and India. And I think that this idea of a Shia crescent both has a certain amount of reality for those countries with large Shia populations, or Shia populations in sensitive areas like the oil-producing regions of Saudi Arabia or the Gulf countries, but is used as a bugaboo to scare people in countries like Egypt. I recall arriving in Egypt and reading articles in the paper which talked about attempts to convert people in Egypt. There are no Shia in Egypt. There haven't been Shia in Egypt since the 12th century. This is a patent attempt to manipulate popular fears. So I think you can talk about the real issues involved in a country like Lebanon or Iraq or other Gulf countries where there is a large Shia population, and in particular where the proximity of Iran to, say, Bahrain or to, say, Kuwait arouses concern. And you mix that in with the non-democratic, unrepresentative nature of these regimes, and you do have a problem. And the way in which this can be manipulated or played, for example, in the case of Yemen, where there's no evidence that the Iranians are supporting the so-called Houthi rebels in the northern part of the country, but that is used, the fear of that is used to some extent, I think, to manipulate the United States, and to some extent to mobilize support for the regime in the Arab world.
Okay, let's get some reaction back here in the studio.
Again, the question, the assumption is that all the Shias, are united, all Sunnis are united, which is not the case. Even inside Lebanon, historically, there have been always conflicts between Amal and Hezbollah and others. And the main question, I think the main worry of the Arab world led by Saudi Arabia is that Iran would become more and more influential in Iraq. This is the most significant thing. And of course, relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which Israelis are most concerned, in case there is something that is closest to Israel, and then so there are possibilities of creating lots of problems. So it's not a crescent as such, but there are pockets of Shi'i that side with Iran, depending on the situation, you know. And there are times that even they change their policies. As for a significant minority of Shiis in different Arab worlds, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in the 80s there was some problem in Al-Sharqiyya province, which is a mainly oil province of Saudi Arabia. There was some revolt by the Shiis, but it was suppressed later. Saudis changed their policy to our Shiis, but now there hasn't been any problem, so they have good relationship with the Saudi problem. So I really do not see this scenario that Shiis are getting behind Iran and Sunnis are getting behind Saudi Arabia.
I agree with you that there's not a monolithic Shia reaction anywhere, but there are, as you just said, so important pieces, and which are related not only to the nuclear program. So, for example, and this speaks to Rashid's point about unelected democratic governments, it doesn't break down that easily if you, depending on how you classify the Fatah government, which certainly does go through election processes. There is now a lot of concern about Iran, surprisingly enough, among Fatah leaders who see connections with Hamas, and they are, again, speaking out vociferously in private about this and injecting that issue actually into the negotiations that are going on.
Peter, one country we have not talked about yet is Pakistan, a hugely significant, overwhelmingly Muslim country. Do we have any overwhelming sense about what their view of Iran's nuclear ambitions is?
I don't think there's a very well-formed view in Pakistan, at least it hasn't been expressed to my knowledge. I think there's concern about the destabilization of the region generally, but Pakistan's primary interest is India. I don't think they perceive a threat from Iran per se. It's more of a question of a threat of destabilization generally.
Rashid Khalidi, what would you say on Pakistan?
Well, let me just bring another element in here, and it relates to Pakistan. And that's the perception of Iran and the perception of some other peoples and countries, which is the fear that many people have, I think, of the fact that there's only one nuclear power in the Middle East, and that's Israel. This is the reason, if the Iranians are in fact moving towards weaponization and their nuclear program is directed at producing nuclear weapons, or at least a large part, I think, of the reason there's a concern in Iran. They are afraid of Israel. They're afraid of the United States. They're also, I think, to some extent, perhaps afraid of Pakistan, which is a country that Iran borders on, after all, which is a country that has a very powerful minority tendency among some of its Sunnis of very strong anti-Shia feeling. There are pogroms, there are massacres of Shia in Pakistan. That's not the government, of course, that's engaging in those things. But I think there's a reason for them to be concerned, at least, at the prospect of a Taliban fanatic Sunni regime in Afghanistan and of some government change in Pakistan leading to a nuclear power being taken over by people who hate Shia. So they're not just afraid of Israel, they're not just afraid of the United States. The premise of this program, of course, is that Iran is this looming danger for everybody, and nobody looks at the fact that however objectionable we may find Iran's behavior in some spheres, there are good reasons for any government of Iran that has something of an independent policy
Actually,
to
you know,
be afraid.
I got to tell you, Professor Khalidi, it's the next question on my sheet, going to the other side of that. But Janice Stein wants a word first.
I agree with Rashid.
You anticipated my next question.
I agree with Rashid, and he makes a very important point, actually, about the local dynamics that are operating in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran. In a sense, Afghanistan, Iran has strong interests in Afghanistan. Pakistan has strong interests in Afghanistan. And again here, the military, the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, is not a fan of Iranian engagement in Afghanistan. They historically, for the last 25 years at least, have seen Afghanistan as their strategic backyard. So much of the tension between Pakistan and Iran is local in that sense.
Quick word on
Right.
this.
Well, you know, I mean, I think the Pakistanis are not concerned, in a sense, at all about Iranian nuclear capabilities, because actually they think that even if Iran becomes nuclear, you know, there is another problem. There's less pressure on Pakistanis and Indians for disarmament and other things. But another point that we talked of the government of the elite, but another main issue is that the ordinary people who are heavily supportive of Iran in Pakistan, in the Arab world, in the Palestinian territories, and it's mostly because of the situation in Israeli Palestinians. So far as there is occupation of Israel, now you'll find I'm so popular.
That's chapter 3.
Yes, okay,
we're still in the middle of chapter 1 here. We're going to go to chapter 3. Peter, you want a word, and then I want to go where
Well, just very
Rashid
quickly,
Khalidi was going.
Just very quickly, I certainly agree with Janice that the primary area where Iran and Pakistan butt up against one another is in Afghanistan, and there's certainly a history there, and there's some difficulty there, and so on. But I don't think that there's a sense in the Pakistani elite, at least, that there is the prospect of a direct confrontation with Iran, or that such a thing is likely or is sought. And so I think that when we talk about this relationship between Iran and Pakistan, as Janice says, we have to look at the local situation on the ground in Afghanistan, but not in a strategic sense.
Okay, as promised, and without further ado, can I ask Michael Smith, the Globe and Mail quote, let's bring that up right now. Iran's aggressive posture in the Middle East is, in part, a reaction to its fears of being overwhelmed by Sunni countries surrounding the Shia island. True, Iraq is a Shia majority, but the years of Sunni rule under Mr. Saddam Hussein and the ambiguity of Americans in finalizing the Iraqi government around its Shia majority heightened Iranian suspicions. The decade-long war against Iran by Mr. Hussein's Sunni regime was supported by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and politely ignored by the West and the United Nations. Iran has not forgotten that. So, Professor Khalidi, are Sunni countries aware enough, in your view, of the legitimate fears that Iran has for itself?
I don't think that some, or most, or many at least, of the regimes in the Arab world are terribly sensitive to Iranian concerns. They fear the revolutionary potential of the Iranian government, not just in terms of its ability to arouse their Shia populations where those exist. There are no Shia in Palestine, and yet it is Iranian support as well as Syrian support for Hamas, which helps to keep Hamas afloat, whence the fears that Janice Stein mentioned among the Fatah leadership. So you have in Hamas and in Fatah two groups that are struggling for supremacy in Palestinian politics, each strongly supported by external backers. In the case of Fatah, the United States and Israel. In the case of Hamas, Iran and Syria. And that has nothing to do with Sunni Shia things. But I think that there is, in particular in the United States, a complete absence of any sense that the Iranians may have some reason to fear the United States, which after all has bases in virtually every single country surrounding Iran. I mean, imagine how the United States would feel if Iran had bases in every country surrounding the United States. We never think, we in the United States never think in those terms. I think it's something worth pointing out.
Okay. Just to add to what Rashid just said, it's actually quite interesting when we go back to that famous Bush speech in which that phrase was written by one of our own, Axis of Evil, right?
David Frum, yes.
And that, if you look at that, North Korea,
you can have him back.
Iraq, yes.
You know what? Funnily enough, he's actually in Toronto today giving a speech, which is extremely well attended at this moment.
I know.
I presume when you say one of our own, you mean he's a Canadian.
I mean, he's a Canadian, exactly. And so you would identify Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. Well, Iraq, everybody looks and knows what happened. North Korea, there's been an extraordinarily tense relationship with the United States. So when you talk to Iranians over and over and over again, there is a real palpable fear which exists of an attack against the Iranian regime. Now that is in no way, let me make that absolutely clear, excusing the rhetoric of President Ahmadinejad, which plays into it, frightens almost every sane person who listens to it, and it's that lethal combination of inflammatory rhetoric plus reports over and over from the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran is not fully disclosing what it's doing that fuels this.
Professor Rahman.
Well, you know, the reason why Ahmadinejad has become so popular in the region, you know, in the Arab world, in the Palestinian territories and others, is exactly because he takes advantage of the mess that Americans and their allies created in the region, you know, and the continued problem, unresolved issue of Palestinians. So that's why some people say that he's crazy, he's mad. He's not mad. He's a shameless, brazen, politician, you know, who takes advantage of these things and points to some realities that many people say that, yes, he's right. But everybody knows
if you take the statement that he just made in New York about September 11th being orchestrated by the United States.
He lives on these outrageous things. If he comes and does not say this, now he added another denial to his arsenal of first, this was Holocaust denial, now 9/11 denial. So many people refer to him, and this is exactly how he avoids the internal problems inside Iran, you know,
Okay, let me
which
pick
has
up
created
on,
such a mess, you know.
Saeed Rahman, let me pick up on something you said a few moments ago, and I want to put it to Peter Jones, and that is we've been talking about Sunni fears about Iran potentially acquiring nuclear capability here. I want to ask you, Peter Jones, to start us off on some discussion about whether Israel rightly believes that if Iran were to get the bomb, it would represent an existential threat to Israel. In other words, that Iran could literally wipe Israel off the face of the map were it to acquire an adequate supply of nuclear weapons. Clearly, Benjamin Netanyahu believes that and says he believes it. What do you believe?
Well, he says he believes it. Certainly it would be a threat to Israel. There's no question. It would be a threat to many countries in the region. But I think that we have to make a distinction between Ahmadinejad's rhetoric and what we've seen over the years as the actual actions of the regime. On matters of sort of national survival, they've tended to be fairly clear-headed and rational, if I can use that word, in terms of many of the things that they've done. So I think this idea that knowing what the Israeli response would be, the Iranians would just launch a nuclear strike against Israel is quite far-fetched. And I think a lot of Israelis know that Iran can be deterred from launching a nuclear strike. I think the Israeli fears are a bit more subtle than that. I think they fear that if Iran gets the bomb, it will be emboldened to act in certain ways that it doesn't feel it can act in now. I think they feel that Iran's having the nuclear weapon will give it certain power over the Arab states and so on, which could be to Israel's detriment. And I think there's an even more subtle fear, which is that over time, if Iran is nuclear armed, many Israelis will leave Israel, or people who might have emigrated there will choose not to emigrate. And so the Israeli project over many years will begin to suffer from that sense. But I think the fear of an attack out of the blue, a nuclear strike against Israel, is somewhat overdone, frankly.
Rashid Khalidi, what do you say on the issue of whether a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat for Israel?
I would agree with that. I don't think that it does represent an existential threat to Israel or anyone else, because it seems to me, exactly as we just heard, that Iran has shown that its behavior is much more calculated than the outrageous, provocative rhetoric of Ahmadinejad would make you think. I think that, in fact, whatever the Prime Minister of Israel says, I don't think Israeli decision makers are in the least deluded about the fact that there is, in fact, no existential threat to Israel, certainly not from a potential Iranian nuclear, weapons. But I think that this is shamelessly exploited, the fear, both in the United States, in the American Jewish community, where Michael Oren was scaring people at what we read
He's the Israeli ambassador to your country.
The Israeli ambassador in Washington was in various synagogues on Yom Kippur, giving the same speech in several synagogues, in which he was basically terrifying people with the prospect of a nuclear holocaust, which could affect Israel. And given the sensitivity, the understandable sensitivity that people have to any existential danger that might affect Israel, this is, to my way of thinking, quite irresponsible and has to be looked at very carefully. Why are these fears being exploited? And I think that clearly an Iran that had nuclear weapons, I think, would be something undesirable. I think that non-proliferation in that region is something that everybody should be working on, which means working on getting the Israeli nuclear deterrent back in the box somehow, or within an arms control regime. However, I think what Israeli security managers are concerned about, exactly as we just heard, is that Iran would have more freedom of action. It would be inconvenient for Israel. Iran would be more powerful, would be less constrained in some ways, but pose an existential threat? Absolutely not. Israel has several hundred nuclear warheads. It could incinerate the entirety of Iran 8 or 20 times or 12 times over. There's no possibility of Iran using nuclear weapons against Israel. No possibility whatsoever.
Just to speak to Rashid's point, let me make the same distinction that you did earlier, Rashid, between the government and the street. All right, and there is a street in Israeli politics, like there is in other parts of the Middle East. And when you hear, Ahmadinejad repeatedly deny the Holocaust, when he makes the kind of speech that he did in New York just a few weeks ago, what does the street hear? The street hears what it thinks is an absolutely irrational speech made by a leader who has never been disavowed by Khamenei at all. In fact, the contrary, the regime has been reinforced. And in a sense, what they hear is this kind of speech playing into language which to the street is utterly evocative of Holocaust by a state that is moving forward to acquire nuclear weapons. So I
Janice,
think
you don't think that the things that Ahmadinejad has said, these objectionable things, are being repeated by an echo chamber from rooftops, by loudspeakers, with an objective, by responsible people in the Israeli government?
Look, of course there's always strategic objectives by political leaders, but if we go to the street and the understanding, and Peter alluded to this, frankly, earlier, if you go to the street and what it hears and what it feels, there is genuinely palpable fear, and that's where you actually get the talk of immigration. There's a feeling that were this to happen. Now, if you actually look at scenarios of how a nuclear exchange could happen between Israel and Iran, it's very complicated. And the kind of notion that there would be a preemptive strike by Iran against Israel, that would have to be an act of suicide, right? And self-incineration, frankly. But again, look at the language that comes out of the regime. There is very little done to allay the street's fears in Israel that this kind of scenario is not possible.
Let me put this to Saeed Renema, which is that you have to believe in the rational argument of deterrence, I guess if you're an Israeli, not to believe that a nuclear-tipped Iran is not a problem. And I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of people who do not believe that the Iranian regime acts with the rationality of deterrence as underpinning its thinking. Do you think they react that way?
First of all, I do not believe at all for a second that there is an existential threat on Israel on the part of Iran. It's impossible. Iran does not have the nuclear capability.
Well, not today, but
not have the missile
someday.
Capabilities. Suppose someday it has. I don't think that these mullahs are at the same time are very shrewd people, and they know their benefits. They are taking advantage of it. The reason why Janice mentions the atmosphere in the streets. The atmosphere in the streets is created by Israeli media and then by its government. Ahmadinejad for Israel, Israeli right wing. What a God-given thing, and this is exactly what they said it during the election.
But do you think are the Iranians motivated by the rational policy of deterrence?
First of all, distinguish between Iranians and the Iranian regime. I think, of course,
the
Iranians are very, very reasonable.
How about the regime?
The regime, yes, I think it is. First of all, don't think that Ahmadinejad is the main decision maker. Ahmadinejad may even in few months, somehow disappear.
I don't think so.
Well,
and you can't count on it.
No, I don't say that necessarily it would be the case, but Ahmadinejad is a part of the new junta. The Iranian regime has evolved, from after the revolution, from a clerical oligarchy, became a clerical military oligarchy. Now it's moving toward a military clerical junta, But the case is that this does not mean that Ahmadinejad is the new general, is the Pinochet of is going to stand
Let me
there.
try this with Peter Jones, though. I think it's fair to say, being careful in the way we put this, but I think it's fair to say that deterrence worked between the Soviets and the Americans because nobody thought that there was a religious belief by either one of those governments to seek Armageddon or to seek the eventual apocalypse. There are people who believe that Iran would not be so deterred because the notion of somehow, seeking that out or experiencing that, the regime might not have too tough a time with that. What's your thought?
I don't agree. I mean, first of all, just as a historical footnote, I don't think deterrence necessarily worked all that well all the time between the Soviets and the Americans. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis and some other things where it almost fell apart. But to come to the present day issue, I think that one of the problems that we have is that people very often assume that because a different group of people have different values, therefore they cannot be deterred. But deterrence is not really about the values of the other side. Deterrence is about what the other side values. And so long as the other side values its existence, and in this particular case, as long as the other side, being the ruling regime in Iran, values the continuation of the regime and values its continuation in power, I think they can be deterred. They may not sort of respond to the same stimuli that the Russians might have and all the rest of it. That's something that'll have to be worked through. And one of the things that the Cold War does tell us, however, is that for this to work over a long period of time, the two sides have to have a relationship. They have to talk to each other. They have to communicate their red lines very clearly. They have to have an understanding, a set of understandings as to what the red lines are. And the fact that they're not talking to one another at all right now is a problem. And so if Iran is going to go down this road of acquiring a nuclear capability, common sense dictates that at some point they're going to have to recognize they'll have to have some set of understandings with the Israelis and with the Americans. So that's the next great challenge for the system. And as long as people like Ahmadinejad are making these ridiculous speeches, that's going to be a problem. But as one of the guests said, Ahmadinejad is far from the most powerful man in Iran. There are others who are much more powerful and who we will see if they're much more rational.
You know, it's really interesting because if you watched Ahmadinejad when he was in New York, as I did, he began with this inflammatory speech and then made an offer to return to the table to negotiations, which, as Peter says, are absolutely essential. There has to be a dialogue between Tehran and Washington because there's no other alternative, frankly. That having been said, when he was asked, well, how can you ask for a dialogue? One of the reporters asked him, and it was fascinating. How can you ask for dialogue with the United States when you've just accused them of orchestrating the 9/11 attack in order to dominate the global economy? He said with a great puzzlement, did I say anything wrong? So there, at the best, if you want to be most charitable, there was a complete inability here to read the different contexts in which his remarks are heard.
Do you think, Rashid Khalidi, that Israel's position on nuclear weapons has always been, we're not going to confirm that we've got them, we're not going to confirm that we don't have them. They have a kind of a deliberate ambiguity about having nuclear weapons. Do you think they should put that aside for now and be categorical if they've got them, just to let Iran know that, we mean business?
Everybody knows that Israel has them. I think that Israel should be brought into, difficult though it will be, for any American politician to do anything that an Israeli leadership does not want to do. Israel should be brought into a nuclear non-proliferation regime in the United States, in the Middle East, sorry. And I think that's perhaps one of the few ways to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, which I think is an outcome which would be which would all be better off if it were prevented. It's going to be very difficult to bring the Iranians into a dialogue with the United States, not just because of provocative or outrageous actions of Ahmadinejad or other leading figures in the regime, but because of enormous ill will and enormous hostility to Iran in important sectors of American politics. And it's going to be difficult because there are major interests where the two countries diverge. I think it is absolutely essential, however, an American-Iranian détente and bringing the United States, Iran, and Israel, and everybody else in the region around the table and discussing non-proliferation is absolutely essential. You've had détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. You've had détente between China and the Soviet Union and China and the United States. And you've had, not détente, I'm sorry, deterrence, mutual deterrence, and mutual deterrence between Pakistan and India. Those are countries where those were conflicts where there was not the same potential for open warfare, which is constantly there in the Middle East. It would be terribly, terribly dangerous to have nuclear weapons proliferate in the Middle East, because I don't think Iran would be the only other country that would get them. Once the Iranians get them, I think one would have to worry about Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. So I think such a regime is absolutely essential, and I think it's more important than some of the other interests. I think Israeli policymakers are absolutely cynical in manipulating the understandable, legitimate fear of public opinion in Israel. They understand perfectly how rational the Iranians are. They've dealt with them over Lebanon. They've dealt with them when they sent them weapons during the Iraq War. They understand that. They're manipulating this in a completely cynical way, in my view. And that's one of the things that has to be overcome. Israel just doesn't want Iran to be stronger.
As you know, just last week there was a vote in IAEA to bring Israel to
International Atomic Energy Agency.
You know, so that Israel would become a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But ironically, Israelis, Americans all voted against it. So the vote was some 48 to 52 against 48. You know, so they wanted Israel to become part of it. And of course, the excuses that they brought were very funny. They said that if Israel becomes a signatory to this, then we cannot move toward the total disarmament in the Middle East, you know, which is, of course, this is the funniest thing that you can, funniest excuse that you can hear. Israel has nuclear bomb, has more than bombs than China has, you know. It's got the, it said that China has got 150.
Know that, right?
Nobody knows, but there are estimates. There are estimates that if Americans have over 2,000, Russians have over 2,500, at least they know that Chinese have 150, Israelis have 160 or so. So nobody knows this, but definitely Israel should become a signatory to NPT, and then that problem could disappear.
Okay,
but
let me try this then.
They don't allow it.
Michael Smith, I'm just going to read the first half of this because we're getting tight on time here. This is the graphic on page 3. The U.S., and Peter, I'll get you to comment on this first. The U.S. knows full well that with the smallest move against Iran, Israel and 32 U.S. military bases in the region would not be out of reach of our missiles and would be destroyed. That's an Iranian official who says that. How do statements such as that, Peter Jones, do you think affect the situation on the ground?
Well, I think what the Iranians doing is they're trying to put forward a vision of deterrence, or a version of deterrence. They're trying to say, you cannot attack us with impunity. We do have ways to attack you back, even if we don't have the same kinds of weaponry that the United States has. So I think one way of reading it is simply to say that it's the Iranians saying that we cannot be attacked with impunity, we can fight back. And it's not new. I've been in Iran some years ago, and people were saying that if Iran is attacked, we will attack back by means of hitting American bases and American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I mean, in one sense, you know, it sounds very threatening, it sounds very upsetting, but if you look at it from the Iranian perspective, it's just simply a statement of deterrence.
Okay, let me follow up with Janice on this. We just, you know, kind of explored earlier the notion that Iran, regardless of its bellicosity, does have some legitimate fears that have to be addressed by the Sunni part of this equation. Similarly, regardless of Israel's well-founded legitimate security concerns and fears, does it have to consider Iran's fears as the other side of this equation as well?
There's no question. I mean, there's a debilitating rhetoric right now where I actually think that each side fears attack by the other. And that I don't think it's cynical and strategic on the part of the Iranian government.
It's real.
It's a genuine, real fear, and I think it's a genuine, real fear on the part of Israel's government. And that's a very dangerous situation, and I think this is probably the most dangerous relationship in the world today. It's a very dangerous situation because when you fear that, the urge is, the colloquial expression is, use it or lose it, right? And this, in the history of nuclear deterrence, you need to have enough nuclear weapons to survive an attack by the other in order for some stability to be built into the relationship. We don't have that now in the region. And so these transitional moments are terribly, terribly dangerous moments.
Can I follow up with you on this?
No mutual deterrence here, real mutual fear.
Let me understand this, though. I guess the conventional wisdom is that the Israelis have nuclear weapons and that they are land-based. Do they have them in the air as well? Do they have plane-based?
And again, anybody who knows doesn't talk, and anybody who talks doesn't know, but certainly the estimates are they're sea-based as well as land-based. They're offshore on submarines. So
Israel could withstand
theoretically
a first strike.
But Iran could not. So if you follow that logic, the temptation would therefore be, were Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, to use it. And that's the pernicious logic.
Well, hang on. Let me. Sorry, forgive me, Professor Runneman, but I want to try this with Rashid Khalidi. There's a Middle East analyst named Gwyn Dyer who's over the UK. He's from here as well. He writes in his latest book that Iran, quote, wouldn't dream of attacking Israel with nuclear weapons even if they had them, because that would unleash a nuclear Armageddon on their own country. You agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that this is a regime, whatever else it's done, it's shown an exquisite concern for its own self-preservation. The idea that they would voluntarily self-immolate is ludicrous. Yes, I think they would be very, very reluctant to do any such thing. And I think that their bellicosity partly has to do with the nature of a revolutionary regime, and it is a provocative and in some cases obnoxious outlook. But it's partly to do with a paranoia and fear that's deeply rooted in Iranian history. Iran has been browbeaten by its great neighbors, Russia, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, over all of its modern history. It's not like they have no reason to be paranoid. I mean, they have been beaten up on by all of their neighbors.
Yeah, Janice Stein was saying even paranoids have enemies from time to time. We're in less than 10 minutes to go here. Let's go into the home stretch with this. We asked the question whether a Sunni-Israeli alliance or something is possible. Michael Smith from the Times of London, please. This from June of earlier this year. Saudi Arabia has conducted tests to stand down its air defenses to enable Israeli jets to make a bombing raid on Iran's nuclear facilities, the Times can reveal. In the week that the UN Security Council imposed a new round of sanctions on Tehran, defense sources in the Gulf say that Riyadh has agreed to allow Israel to use a narrow corridor of its airspace in the north of the country to shorten the distance for a bombing run on Iran. The Saudis, this is a quote, the Saudis have given their permission for the Israelis to pass over, and they will look the other way, said a U.S. defense source in the area. They have already done tests to make sure their own jets aren't scrambled and no one gets shot down. This has all been done with the agreement of the U.S. State Department. Now, Peter Jones, we're going to go around on this. Don't worry, everybody's going to get a kick at this one. Peter, the Saudis later dismissed this report as slanderous. Do you think there is any truth here?
Well, there may be. It's certainly, as we talked about at the beginning of the program, the elites in Saudi Arabia, the regime, have no love lost for Iran. So there may be some sense that helping the Israelis to make this attack may be in the elite's interest. But I think they have to be very careful, and they know they have to be very careful in the sense that an attack like this would inflame, as Janice says, the Arab street in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And if it came out publicly, as it almost surely would, that Israeli planes overflew Saudi Arabia and the Saudis looked the other way, the Saudi regime would have an awful problem on its hands in terms of its own legitimacy with its people. So I think that these sorts of stories, these sorts of conspiracy theories, they make good press, they make good articles in the Times, but the reality is much more complicated.
Saeed Ranama, there's got to be a Jackie Mason line here somewhere about the Saudis and Passover. With regard, but I'm going to leave that to Jackie Mason.
That is very bad.
Yeah. Anyway, do you buy any of this stuff from the Times?
Well, it depends, you know. As it stands now, it's impossible for Saudis to would allow Israeli jets use its airspace to attack Iran. You know, even Turkey in the past, you know, could not dare it, despite the fact all the better situation that they had.
Impossible to believe there are any discussions in that regard
at this stage, but there are chances. If there is a war, first of all, everybody talks of nuclear Armageddon. It doesn't need to be nuclear Armageddon. If there is a war on Iran, you know, so definitely the strategy would be Americans do not want to send troops. Israel does not have the capability of sending troops. So it would be massive air bombardment, which is going to really demolish the infrastructure, main military areas and others. And then Iranians immediately would start use their capabilities. They have lots of capabilities. They are not like Saddam regime, you know, at the end of its regime. It's a very powerful regime. It's a triple-decker bureaucracy military now, at least.
And not going anywhere.
They definitely, there are several theaters that they are contemplating on. One is at the Hormuz, in the mouth of Persian Gulf, you know, that they would try to drag Americans in, you know, by mobile batteries and other things. Then they have got the Iraqis, and then in Afghanistan. The Iraqi situation, and of course Hezbollah in Lebanon. The main issue is that Saudis will get into war if Iran gets to the position that it's going to, in a sense, take over Iraq. through its different cronies which are in power now. In that case, Saudis definitely would give in, and then would not be fearful of.
Let me get Rashid Khalidi on this quote from the Times of London that there might be some kind of understanding or entente between the Saudis and the